10:45, we're right on schedule. Nick is, I think, ready to go with his presentation. Nick is a past president of the California Map Society.
Vice president.
You never ascended to the lofty heights of the presidency. Okay, a former Northern California vice president, he is or was, you still practice, so you were practicing psychiatrist as well as a professor up at UCSF. You've done a ton of things over the course of your life that don't include maps. So I'm not going to try and summarize them. I'll just turn it right over to you. Okay, Nick?
Okay, well, thank you, John. Yeah, I found over the many years I've been alive that you can't shoot a moving target. So you got to keep going and doing things. I'm looking at the participants. There's 38. At some point, we may get some additional participants from the map fair. I don't know if they're going to link in or not. They were notified and supposedly, so we may have some guests join us along the way. Okay, well, today you can see behind me, I did decide to put this up. One of the things I'm going to show in my presentation today, but you'll have to wait a little bit until we get around to it. Tom, do you want to show the first slide?
Yep.
So today, the story of this presentation is that, let me see if we're going to see the first slide, because I want to.
Hold on just a second. Just a second. All right, there we go. And give me a second more. Okay.
So that's the next slide. So when it came time to think about a third edition of my Star Maps book, I decided to add some additional chapters. One of them was on pictorials, which is what I'm collecting right now. And the other one, if you notice the subtitle, History, Artistry, and Cartography. Well, originally, when I came up with the idea for this book, I thought about how beautiful some of the star maps were, and they were artistic. They had a lot of artistic symbols, and I'll show you some of those later. But I thought, I'm going to turn the tables and write a chapter on not how artistic star maps are, but how celestial maps ended up in real art that was dedicated primarily for the beauty of itself, but used celestial mapping themes. So that's the subject of this chapter and the subject of what I want to talk about today. Next slide. So again, to convince any of you who are doubters, are celestial maps really maps? Most of you, I think, collect terrestrial, although our numbers are growing with Angel. I think now we can count, Angel, maybe we can count the celestial map collectors now on 2 hands instead of 1 in the world. But at any rate, what are maps? Well, this is a definition from the Oxford Dictionary. They're flat representation of the Earth's surface or a part of it, showing physical, geographical, or political features. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because the implication is that they show real features. And when I talk a little bit later about pictorials, some of those real features are altered. So they take a slight deviance from a traditional terrestrial map that most of you are familiar with. But the definition goes on to say, after a few dots, that it's a similar representation of the sky, showing the relative positions of stars or the surface of a planet. So maps can be extended not only to be terrestrial, but location of stars in the heavens, where they are in a kind of imaginary celestial grid of longitude and latitude, and features on.
Nick? Nick?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, you broke up for a little bit.
Okay, that's weird. All right, can you hear me now?
Solid for me, Nick. Solid for me.
Yeah, solid for me.
Oh, well, then maybe it was me. Okay.
Okay, well, let me know if you can't hear me or something goes wrong. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to start with arguably the first piece of art. Some of you have seen this before in a kind of favorite art display. Cave paintings. These are certainly among the earliest known pieces of art, dating back some 17,000 years. And the idea was that our Paleolithic ancestors would draw on their caves various images. Some of the most interesting are handprints, basically outlines of their hands, but also they drew real pictures using pigments of animals, humans, and geometric forms, mainly decorative, but also depicting things happening to them that was important in their lives. And there even may include some primitive maps of the heavens, as the next slide shows. This is an image of a wall painting from the Lascaux cave, produced by an unknown artist some 17,000 years ago. And the pictures on the left shows in the center an auroch, which is an early ancestor of cattle. And then you see these various dots surrounding the auroch, not only around its eye, but to the left, lower part circled in blue, and the upper right part circled in red. And a friend of mine, Damien Alice, who is a NASA ambassador, made this slide where he contrasted it to the right with an image of the heavens. And you see in this piece of the heavens, Taurus the bull in the middle, with the Hyades open star cluster, which outlines its face. And then to the upper right, in its shoulder, the Pleiades star cluster. And to the lower left, Orion, the constellation, with the belt of Orion circled in blue. And if you look at the left and right, there's a striking resemblance between these two images, between what the cave painting shows and what can be seen by looking up at the heavens. So arguably, an early ancestor looked up, saw these bright stars in the heavens one night, and came in and reproduced them with a terrestrial theme of animals, but with the right kinds of dots. The dots don't exactly match, but remember, stars move. And in 17,000 years, who's to say in the lower left that Orion's belt didn't have a fourth star intruding into the line? So arguably, this might be the first known works of art with a celestial theme. The first celestial star map. Next slide. Moving ahead to something a little more concrete, but not really concrete, but marble, is the Farnese Atlas. This is a sculpture made out of marble that depicts the Atlas, the son of Zeus, holding up a celestial globe, which is the way he was depicted. And on this globe are depicted 43 of the 48 classical Greek constellations. So it was a work of art, but also had the purpose of showing the constellations in the heavens. It once belonged to Cardinal Farnese, which is where it got its name. And if you go to the National Museum in Naples, you can see this, which is arguably, so far to date, the oldest known celestial map that we have. That is, it all shows a kind of the positioning of the stars vis-a-vis each other. When you look at the globe, it dates back to the 2nd century AD, the statue does, but the globe dates earlier. This is the 2nd century BC, because of the way the stars are positioned. It shows the stars positioned really the way it was in the 2nd century BC. And so it's probably in the copy that was done in the AD period, a copy of something that was produced in the BC period. And interestingly, Hipparchus, the greatest Greek astronomer, was active in the 2nd century BC, so it could have been taken from some of his work. Next slide shows the Farnese Atlas, the way it appears in the museum. You can see poor old Atlas showing his body off a bit, but above in his back, the celestial globe that he's burdened to hold up. And the next slide is a kind of a rubbing that was done of this particular artwork, and you can see the constellations a little clearer. This is from a 1739 edition of a work created by Richard Bentley. And you can see the in the slanting blue line, triple blue lines, the zodiac, and the zodiac constellations that were depicted as they were on the Farnese Atlas globe. And then the other constellations here and there, where you see blank areas, those are areas of the sky that were either damaged or were actually affixed to the marble itself. So this is the oldest constellation map in existence. There may have been others that were drawn on parchment or papyrus that we don't have, that don't exist. But because it's marble, it shows has lasted pretty well through the ages. And you'll notice the constellations are shown left to right reverse from the way it is when we look up at the sky, because it's from the outside looking into the marble rather than from the center of the marble looking out. So this is a beautiful piece of work that's actually a sculpture, art in and of itself, but also shows the constellations. Next slide. In the Middle Ages, after Rome fell, Greek mathematical astronomy disappeared in the West, but continued on in Byzantium and in Islamic countries. In Europe, the manuscripts that were drawn that discuss the poetry of the times, the accompanying star images were really not maps. They were just sort of pictures illustrating the text. They weren't drawn with any degree of accuracy as to the real star placements. They were mainly just, as I said, just to kind of illustrate things. So there's no coordinate system and no accurate star placement. The next slide shows an example that's an exception to this. If we can see the next slide, Tom. Yeah, this is Islamic. And what you see in this manuscript is Perseus on the left and Andromeda on the right. And you'll see it's stylized this is from a 10th century manuscript from the Oxford University Bodleian Library. And you see here, the figures are clothed in Arabic dress. And a few wrinkles. For example, you see the fish coming in on Andromeda to the right, which probably reflects a Bedouin tradition. And on the left, the Perseus is holding a demon instead of Medusa. But the stars are fairly accurate. If you look at the left and you look at the stars that are depicted here in the Islamic tradition, it looks pretty much the way the sky, the stars in Perseus actually look. In contrast, next slide, to a Western manuscript of, in this case, Aries the Ram, which is also a 10th century manuscript, which is on vellum and is meant primarily to illustrate a book, the Poeticon Astronomicon by Hyginus, who was a Roman author. And in the body, you get a double bonus. I'm sorry, the Poeticon is written in the body in Latin, and this figure of Aries is an illustration of the bigger poem that is Aratus's Phenomenon, another Greek poem. But look at the stars. The stars are placed, there's a bunch of them on the back. You see them going around the back, and a bunch of them on the belly. Not really related to anything real. It's just illustrating. They're sort of thrown in there because it's a constellation, but this is the text of Aratus in the lower left. But there's no attempt to create an accurate star map in this Western piece. The same goes for the next slide, which is actually into the Renaissance. This is a printed version from the Aldine Press, 1499. It's meant to illustrate the Poeticon Astronomicon poem. In this case, Cetus, the sea monster, is the poem that's written about. And the image is just this kind of interesting looking woodcut of a sea monster. And the stars are kind of rimming its belly and its tail. Again, not accurately placed at all. The construction of this particular woodcut didn't care about star placement. He just wanted to come up with a figure to illustrate the text of the poem. Next slide. In the Renaissance, things changed a bit, although there was an overlap, as I mentioned. This last one I showed you was into the Renaissance. But in general, things started to move towards real images that were depicted as star maps. A lot of things happened in the Renaissance. You had the recovery of Greek astronomical astronomy. Printing allowed a lot of reproductions of things to be made. You had new lands that were found, especially in the southern hemisphere, with new constellations developed by Western observers. You had advances in terrestrial mapping. Woodcuts gave way to copper etchings, which allowed finer lines to be drawn. And you had the telescope in 1609 come in, where you could then see images really the way they were, mainly with Galileo's beginning. So celestial maps now became more accurate in star placement, even though they continue to kind of tradition themselves as being artistic. So the next slide is from the Book of Hours. This is very famous from Trézerich's Ur de Duc de Berry. And this is a manuscript that was printed on vellum throughout the 15th century. Beautiful piece of work. It's a manuscript, but the top part reflects the stars and the constellations that were prominent in the spring, for the month of June. And Duke de Berry had a lot of things. It was mainly a book of hours for the monks to kind of discern when there was supposed to be different chantings and so on. But because it was made for a duke, it's beautifully done and has a lot of other things. And this is an example in this timpanum of what's available in June. You see the main constellations of June. You see the Cancer, the crab on the left, and you see the lion on the right, and you see in the middle a nice image of the sun. And then you have some of the calendar events in the code, in the inner arch and in the outer arch that were important. However, so this is the practical part, but look at the bottom. It's an artistic piece. Going along with this was a piece of, let's see, this is not the one I thought it was, but that's the one I want. Here you see an artistic piece. And what it shows is it shows the Duc de Berry's residence, this Parisian residence, and it shows people doing things that they do in the springtime. They're gathering the hay, they're sowing things, and in the background you see the city of Paris with the large tower of Saint-Chapelle on the right, and the other pieces from the palace itself in the left. So it's really an art piece, and yet it takes on a celestial theme because it was made as a book of hours, and because it illustrates what you do in June on Earth to kind of go along with the atmospheric events. Next slide. This is the first printed celestial map. It's done by Albrecht Dürer in 1515. It's one of two. The northern hemisphere is shown here, and the southern is, I'm not showing that one, but that's also his companion. And what is this? This is a real map. You see it's centered on the North Pole for the ecliptic. And around the rim, you see the ecliptic. You see basically the zodiac constellations 90 degrees away. And so but it's a map. The stars are placed accurately in a grid. Where's the grid? Well, you see on the periphery degree marks going around 360 degrees in black and white. And if you get your straight edge out, you go from the middle along one of the radial lines to the outside, it's 90 degrees. So if you want to locate a star, you find where it is in celestial latitude and celestial longitude, and then you take your grid and you mark 90 degrees and you see what percent that star is located of 90 degrees. So you can actually locate a star in celestial latitude and longitude. So it is truly a map where star placement are accurately depicted. But it's even more than that. In the corners, you notice famous astronomers. They didn't have to be there, but they're added for artistic purposes. So this shows you the artistry I mentioned earlier of celestial maps. They were actually constructed not only to be accurate visualizations of placements of the stars, but they had some artistic flair as well, in this case showing some astronomers. And one can argue that the depictions and the drawing of the constellation images themselves are artistic pieces. Next slide. This is one of my favorite paintings ever. Some of you may recognize this. It's the Ambassadors, done by Hans Holbein the Younger in 1533. It shows Jean de Dinteville, French ambassador to England on the left, and on the right, Georges de Selby, Bishop of Lavaur, two very stately and important and prominent men who served ambassadorial duties. But look at the middle. Look at the table in the middle. It's all kinds of scientific and musical instruments. And here you see a celestial globe on the left, and then you see going to the right various quadrants and different instruments for telling degrees in the heavens. And on the lower table, the lower part of the table, you see a terrestrial globe, and you see musical instruments and mathematical texts. So the image, if you pull back now, Tom, the idea of this was symbolically to say, this is what the rich and intelligent men of that era in the Renaissance do, that they're surrounded by trappings of science and art and music. And this is what you do when you're prominent and important in the world. So celestial imagery is used here to kind of prove a point about these people. But there's a secret to this piece. If you look at the bottom, there's this weird structure going in a diagonal. What is this? My goodness, what is this doing here? Hans Holbein put this as an example of anamorphosis in a painting. And what that is an example of putting something in a painting that has a different kind of symbolic value. Anybody know what this symbol is? Okay, John, what is it?
It's a skull.
It's a skull. How do we know that? If you go to the National Gallery in London and you go to the corner of this image, either the right or the left, and you look at it at an angle, this thing will become not this weird collapsed skull, but it'll expand into a real skull. And it's an example of a little joke that Hans Holbein put in to kind of get the observer to think about what he's saying. And the message is, you can be important, you can be rich, you can be cultured, you can really achieve in life, but sooner or later you're going to die. And death is what we all have to face at the end of our lifestyle. So it's a marvelous, wonderful piece of art showing a lot of things and a lot of symbolism. And if you ever have a chance to see it, it's really quite exciting to see. Okay, next slide. This is another piece of the Renaissance. And basically, this is from the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It's the dome, and it was painted by Sigoli, who was actually himself an amateur astronomer and a friend of Galileo. And what it depicts, if you want to zoom in, is it's the Annunciation. So you see Mary, Virgin Mary, ascending into the heavens, and all the angels and all the various saints in the heavens, and in the center is God. But here she is, ready to go up. But if you look at her feet, she's standing on this circular thing. And if you expand it, what it is it's a little bit blurred, but what it is a drawing of the moon as depicted in Galileo's 1610 Sidereus Nuncius book. Sigoli was a friend of Galileo's, and so 2 years after this famous work came out showing what the moon looks like in a telescope, it was put into this wonderful work of art as a demonstration of an accurate view of the moon through the telescope that Sigoli thought he would display. Okay, next slide. And in this I show, this is a Celerius. Celerius, go back a bit. Celerius is sort of the epitome of pretty celestial images. Celerius's Atlas, 1660, several editions came after that, showed a number of things. Some were constellations, some were actually depictions of drawings of the text about how the planets go around, how the planets go around the sun, and how the sun and all the planets go around the earth. So you show the Ptolemaic system and the Copernicus system. But this is the constellation map, beautifully drawn, again, with very artistic images. You see right there the Big Dipper, and you see Ursa Major and the various constellations. But zoom out. But you also see pieces of artistry in the corners. And here, instead of seeing scientists, you see putti, clouds. You can see these little angelic putti holding up banners. Height of Baroque. And so reflecting the Baroque tradition of the times, this piece has a lot of artistic features as well as showing practically depiction of the constellations and how they related to each other. Again, you see degrees along the periphery, and then see, in this case, to the right, go up a little bit more, Tom, show that line going to the left from the center. He actually saved you from having to do a straight edge by actually putting 90 degrees going from the middle of this piece to the periphery. The zodiac, someone asked about the zodiac. Zodiac probably came to the Greeks from the east around the 6th century BC. It was picked up by a lot of Greek, probably was developed in the 6th century, and shortly thereafter started to be used primarily for its astrological purposes. Because of that, it wasn't used for individuals, it was used for prominent, important people. But later on, as time went on, rich people could have their astrological signs read as well. And in fact, many astronomers, even as late as the 16th century, I mean, Kepler was one, for example, on the side, did zodiacal readings of people to make a little extra money. So they were astronomers by day and astrologers by evening. And astrology was seen as the practical piece of astronomy to the ancient Greeks. In other words, the science of the heavens were depicted in these images in astronomy, but astrology was one to depict the fate of the country or your own life if you were a king.
Nick, there was a second part of the question. When I was looking at the cave paintings,
Yeah.
I noticed that the Hyades was one of the 3 clusters. And I looked up the Hyades and it falls in the constellation Taurus. And the Hyades were in the eye of the Auric, which is a bull. So does this suggest that the Paleolithic man was identifying a constellation of Taurus?
Yeah, good question. Probably not. It's probably a coincidence because there's a lot of Aurochs depicted on cave paintings. The Auric was prominently used for hunting in many sites, and especially around France. And I think the fact that it's a cattle kind of creature, and now it's a modern bull, is probably a coincidence. But because there's no sense of the cattle image, the Auric tradition progressing through time, is actually came through the Mesopotamia, that the idea of it being a bull. So who knows for sure? But it's an interesting coincidence. All right, next slide. Okay, so post-Renaissance includes some of the best known works of art. This is a period from the 1600s to 1900s. I'm going to take a little leeway about the 1600s because when the Renaissance ended is sort of in the eye of the beholder a bit. But in that period were also frontispieces to map atlases, which were also designed mainly as artistic pieces to show the accurate, supposedly, placement of the stars in the rest of the text. And I'll show you an example of that. Their frontispieces were intended to be artistic, to excite the reader to what is the context of the map, whether it's terrestrial or celestial, and to get them to buy it. And so it was mainly symbolic and artistic that the frontispieces were meant to represent for what was shown later on. So the next slide, though, gets back to famous pictures. This is my favorite painter, Johannes Vermeer, in 1688. And here he has a painting which fittingly is called The Astronomer. So the subject of this painting was astronomy. And here you see an astronomer of the time examining his celestial globe with a celestial map of the different constellations. He's got a astronomy book on below him that he's reading. And in the corner, in the background, you see a celestial chart on the cabinet above the title and the signature for Vermeer. Like many Vermeers, he shows subjects near a window and a wonderful showing of light and dark, which he was a master of. And you see here the beautiful shadings and the light coming in to show this busy astronomer at his work. This is from the Louvre. The next slide is also probably familiar to many of you. This is one of Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night images. This particular one was done in 1889 while Van Gogh was a patient at Saint-Remy de Provence. And it likely is not really what he saw from his window, but a kind of an imaginary image based on what he saw from his window at the heavens. And you see here again is an image of a theoretical night sky. You see the village down below. To the left, are the grounds of different things, including the large cypress tree, which is a symbol of death. But look at the heavens. The heavens are the star of the show, if you pardon the pun. You see Venus right next to the tree in white. You see a swirling nebulous-like objects, including stars that were shown, and then to the upper right, a beautiful moon. These are all painted in expressionistic swirling brush strokes. They're really reminiscent of spiral nebulae. The overall effect is to create in the viewer a bizarre, ethereal, and dreamlike view of the heavens and what the heavens represent to us. And it's a beautiful work of art that really shows some of the heavens in all their grandeur. Next slide. Now this is a frontispiece, and this is the granddaddy of all frontispieces. This is the frontispiece to Mercator's Atlas, done in 1595. That's why I'm going to go back a little bit towards the late Renaissance, if you will. But I want to show this one because the granddaddy of all frontispieces, illustrating his atlas of terrestrial maps, what does it show? It shows Atlas looking at a celestial globe. And above Atlas, you see an armillary sphere, which is an instrument used to model the heavens and also had degrees and so on to kind of give a feeling of the celestial grandeur. So I thought it was fitting. Two things are fitting about this. First of all, it has a celestial theme. And second of all, he called it after the namesake of Atlas. And from now on, what do we call these collections of maps and terrestrial and celestial maps? We call them atlases. And so in a sense, they were named from this particular image, if you will, in the original granddaddy of all atlases by Mercator. But which atlas is this? Is this the atlas that carries the celestial globe on his back? Probably, but it could also be another atlas. The Atlas who was the mythical king of Mauritania in ancient mythology. He was supposed to be a great philosopher of Mauritania and an astronomer who produced the first celestial globe. So when you see these images of Atlas looking at the globe, it could be the Greek Atlas with the globe on his back, or it could be this mysterious Mauritanic, if you will, that's the right adjective, who happened to be an astronomer himself and is associated with the first globe. Next slide. This is actually a frontispiece from a celestial atlas. This is the frontispiece from a later version of the Solarius Atlas. And you see what I mean about it being beautiful and symbolic. The idea is you see this thing and you say, wow, I'm going to be a part of the action of what's in this book. I'm going to buy this book. So you buy the atlas that shows all these other prints. And what does this show? Well, it shows Pudi. It shows constellations at the top. It shows Libra. It shows the part of the zodiac. You see the sun. You see the moon. Down below, you see in the center stage, Urania, the muse of astronomy, pointing up at the heavens, giving you a sense of the sense of the unchanging view of the heavens. Around her are surrounded a number of very famous people. Tycho Brahe, you see Copernicus on the right. You see Alfonso the Wise, who comes from the Alphonsine tables. And what is she holding? She's holding an armillary sphere. Down below, I want you to zoom out. And then Copernicus himself is pointing to another armillary sphere, and to the left, under the calyps of Tycho Brahe, is a celestial globe. So all these images are meant to convey the long-lasting fame of what is in the book. That if you buy this book, you're going to be a piece of these famous astronomers, a piece of the muse of astronomy. You're going to see the wonders of the heavens. They're going to open up to you. And so, by golly, put down your shekels for this thing because it's worth buying. Beautiful, beautiful frontispiece from a very wonderful atlas. Okay, next slide. Let's see, I have till 11:30. I'm going to quickly go through a few pictorials. Pictorial maps came out in the 20th century. The 20th century, by then, the constellation images began to disappear from celestial maps because they just got in the way. Telescopes were getting more sophisticated. People were using photographs to find deep sky objects. And so there was really no need for a lot of celestial imagery, including constellations. But this tradition continued in pictorial maps because pictorial maps were meant not to be so accurate as to convey in a message. They were meant to convey a message. You see this pictorial map, and maybe you learn something about space, or you advertise a product by somebody, or you celebrate an event. And the same goes for terrestrial pictorial maps. For that reason, to give you an image and to create an impression, they often employed bright colors, a variety of text formats, cartoonish characters, and humor or satire. Next slide. So here's an example of one of the famous pictorial maps meant to convey a message. This is done by Elizabeth Shurtleff in 1930 or so. And it basically shows, without a lot of Art Deco imagery in the pictures. Go down, you can come out a little bit, Tom, on this one. It shows on the left the constellations as they appear January 1st, and on the right, the constellations as they appear July 1st, with a lot of imagery involved and curious, bright, colorful constellations that kind of get your attention to go out and observe. You see writing on the top and bottom panels describing the constellations, and you see the symbolism of moon, the moon goddess in the upper middle medallion, and the sun god in the lower one. A beautiful work of art that was created to be useful, but also has artistic merit. Next slide is meant to convey another kind of a message. This tells the kids who listen to the Buck Rogers science fiction series on the radio, which is very popular in the 1930s. You send in a box top from Cocoa Malt, and you get this map sent to you courtesy of Buck Rogers, along with a letter from Buck himself. And what it shows, it does show a view of the solar system as was known at the time, with a lot of images about the planets, and it shows some text about how far the planets are from the sun. So it has a view of a solar system mapping to teach young minds a little bit about it. Oh, but look around you. Here's Buck with his jumping suit in the upper right. You see, oh, by the way, you see the seasons on the bottom. The seasons, you see how eclipses work. So it's meant to be to teach kids, but it's also meant as to show off the series and to get you to watch it. Down at the bottom, you see Buck and his friends. Go down at the bottom. Yeah, keep going. You see Wilma and Buck himself, and Killer Kane and Ardella, and you have all these images from the show. You can come out now again. So it does a lot of things. The main thing it does is it gets you to buy Cocoa Malt. So it was really meant as a pictorial map of the heavens to not only sponsor the radio show, but to get you to buy a product because you couldn't get this map in any other way. Next slide. Here's another promotional that was used. Beautiful work of art that was done by Lucien Boucher in 1951, advertising the routes of Air France. So it was meant to show you fly Air France and you become a part of the heavens. That's the message you get. In the bottom, you see a circle of the earth with a lot of the routes that Air France was flying. But what you see around you again are some stylized Art Deco constellations, beautifully done in this work of art by Boucher. And one of the comedic elements, if you want to zoom in on the lower, well, you can't zoom on this one, but you see Cetus, the whale down at the bottom, about ready to eat one of the airplanes. So as the airplane's coming around the corner, the eastern part of the globe, here's old Cetus, the sea monster, ready to devour it as it comes around. So it has some humorous elements as well. But the bottom line is you fly Air France, you fly all over the world, and you get a piece of the heavens along the way. Next slide. And then this is a famous slide by Merrill Lynch. This is one celebrating an event. This is the lunar landing. This was done in 1969, but it's an Art Deco style, in pictorial style. You see the far side of the moon on the left, the near side on the right. Above, you see on the Eagle, so you see a Russian spaceship because they're the ones who went to the far side of the moon. Above, you see a American Eagle with the 3 presidents that were involved with the Apollo program. You see Johnson, Nixon, and Kennedy. On the right, you see the moon with, the moon was, the names of the moon in Latin are named for oceans. So you see the ocean of storms, and they picked it as a storm. And you see the sea of clouds, and they picked it as clouds. So the artistic features have to do with taking literally what the names are in a humorous way to celebrate this great event. And if you go down to the bottom, and you see the Apollo 12 landing site and Apollo 11. And if you want to, but make no mistake, it was an advertisement for Merrill Lynch, because at the bottom you see the ticker tape going across the bottom, showing that Merrill Lynch means business in terms of its stock work. Okay, next slide. I'm going to now go through a few contemporary slides before I stop. With the growth of telescope, as I mentioned, these constellation images disappeared. And so more modern pictures show imaginary surfaces or surfaces of exoplanets or abstract concepts. And the issue is that techniques vary in more modern contemporary images of the heavens, from traditional techniques to less traditional. The first slide shows you a traditional acrylic on canvas image by Susan St. Thomas. These are all local artists. I actually own these pieces, and it's a lot of local artists doing wonderful work at affordable prices. The image here is birth. It's called Vision of Rebirth. So what does she show? She shows the birth of stars in a giant nebula. And you see the nebulae in the red, you see the stars forming in the white. You see beautiful imagery of wisps of hydrogen gas being compressed to form the stars throughout the picture. It's a beautiful piece of art that she used to depict the theme, which is rebirth. The next slide is a fantasy picture done by Stuart Radcliffe from Sacramento. It's called Night Scene on Mars, and it's a fantastic view of what the surface of Mars looks, not meant to be real. But the thing that's interesting about this piece is it's on aluminum. He transferred his basically a pencil artwork to aluminum, and it shines. And so it's a beautiful imagery of a shining kind of celestial piece of art. Next slide. This is the one that was in the background here. This is a picture of a exoplanet, an actual exoplanetary system as imagined by the artist, but it was done digitally produced. And so it has a beautiful, so it's computer generated artwork. It's got a shine to it that you can probably see. And it shows the red star around which are 7 known exoplanets that circle it. This is a TRAPPIST system. And is seen by space, and you're imagining yourself on the 7th planet down below and to the right, looking at the other 6 planets into the red giant that's in the middle. And finally, the last piece I'll show is an abstract piece. This is a traditional acrylic painting on art. This was done by an artist up in Sonoma, Trula Lakai. I love this piece. It's an actual piece of art. She woke up, this woman does actually pictures of Impressionist pictures primarily, but she woke up one day, started painting, and ended up with this thing, which she saw as a celestial invasion. And to me, it has all kinds of imagery in an abstract way. To the lower left, maybe a picture of Earth. It shows a lot of triangles going to the upper right, which could be an exoplanet. And the red thing in the lower part with spinning out 2 bluish 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock clouds could actually be a pulsar. When pulsars spin in the heavens, they give out gas, and it spins out left and right the way we see it. And to me, that was what this conjured up. But it has a lot of celestial imagery in an abstract way that I think one can imagine can be in the unconscious anyway of the artist. I'm going to stop here and take a few questions if there are any.
Thank you, Nick. It's wonderful. And thanks also to Tom Paper for being such an agile projectionist.
Yes, thanks.
as a psychiatrist, is there any psychiatric or medical thought about Vincent van Gogh's Starry Skies, whether these might have been visual hallucinations or auras or anything?
Well, I think that certainly people have talked about Van Gogh having some, he was, had a lot of mental problems, and that some of his paintings reflect that. They also, I believe he also has astigmatism, but his imagery has a lot of auras and flashes around it. And the picture I showed earlier of the young man who did the Mars, if you look closely at some of his stars, they're actually kind of wispy themselves, reminiscent of Van Gogh, not to the extreme. So, and he's a very stable guy. He's a very nice man. I've met him. But in the case of Van Gogh, certainly, I think some of the imagery did reflect maybe some mental issues that he had, as well as maybe some physical limitations.
Maybe one more.
Nick, I was curious about the Farnese Atlas and the fact that there was a globe. I have this idea that paper maps were developed in the 1500s and 1400s and 1500s. But the Farnese Atlas indicates that there was a globe in antiquity. Would that lead you to believe that there were also paper maps of some sort or other kinds of maps?
Probably were. People talk about writings that were done by Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC. We just don't have them. They didn't exist. The globe exists because it's marble. And there are later examples that are maybe 50, 100 years after that, also that are globes. So those lasted because of the material. But we don't have to date any papyrus pictures that have lasted. We know there were papyrus works done, because we have those, but not in the celestial world. The implication is there probably were, because people have referred to Hipparchus writing things down.
Yeah.
And we just don't have examples.
And don't forget, the Ptolemy maps. Those are Greek maps. Those are Greek classical maps. We just don't have the originals on paper. We have the Renaissance copies.
Yeah, he was 2nd century AD, but still, yes, there's all kinds of references. We just don't have them. They don't exist. But you're right about that.
Well,
the earliest maps were from Sumeria, 3,500 years ago, and Egypt has a papyrus gold map, 1500 BCE. So you can trace maps. Rome had maps on concrete. They invented concrete. That's a whole different and really interesting subject about ancient maps.
Yeah,
sure is, Len. Sure is, Len. Yeah, maybe that'll be a talk at some future CMS meeting.
Sometime future.
In the interest of keeping things on schedule,